The Prince and Princess of Wales, they are three children, all greeting well-wishers. 7-year-old Prince Louis breaking protocol and snatching some chocolates given to his father.
Inside the quiet walls of Windsor Castle, Prince Louis sat still as a well-known pianist leaned closer.
We had ours closely watching the royal kiddos. Prince Louis once again totally stealing the show.
Cracked a grin and casually asked him if he could play the piano. What followed froze the room and burned itself into memory, the kind of moment people whisper about later, lowering their voices like it might still be listening. The laughter faded, the air tightened, and Windsor Castle went silent. The pianist smiled, but it wasn't the soft smile adults usually give children. It was sharp, amused, and edged with mockery. The kind that shows up right before a joke lands at someone else's expense. Prince Louis didn't fully understand what was happening yet. He only knew that every adult eye had locked onto him at once, and something heavy pulled tight inside his chest. He was only 7 years old. To the outside world, Prince Louis was the fun one, the kid with the playful waves, the silly faces on palace balconies, the child who never seemed able to stand still for more than a few seconds. Cameras adored him because he was unpredictable, and commentators brushed him off as cheeky and full of energy. He became a punchline, a highlight reel, a harmless distraction. But what nobody ever stopped to ask was why that energy existed at all. So stay right here, because what began as a joke was about to flip into something no one in that room expected. That afternoon at Windsor Castle was supposed to be easy and controlled. It wasn't a concert, and it wasn't a performance of any kind. It was one of those carefully staged royal afternoons where guests sip tea, admire the architecture, exchange polite praise, and leave feeling impressed enough to tell stories later. Among those guests stood a world-famous pianist, known across continents. He wasn't just successful, he was celebrated. Sold-out halls, technical precision, and a reputation for sharp opinions followed him wherever he went. He was the type who spoke about music like it was sacred ground, and only a select few were worthy to step onto it. To him, art meant discipline, sacrifice, and absolute control. Noise without purpose had no place in his world. Mistakes weren't charming. They were weaknesses and childhood curiosity. That was something to outgrow, not indulge. Prince Louis was brought into the room the way royal children often are, briefly, politely, and with perfect timing, long enough to be seen, acknowledged, and then moved along. William stood nearby in conversation with patrons, while Catherine watched closely, offering Louis a steady, reassuring look. The kind mothers give when they sense their child is already overwhelmed. Louis shifted from one foot to the other. The room felt massive and cold, with towering ceilings, tall windows, and rows of painted ancestors lining the walls. Their eyes seemed to cut straight through him, silent and unblinking. He hated rooms like this. They demanded stillness his body didn't know how to give. The pianist noticed him almost instantly. "Ah, this must be the lively one," he said, tilting his head as a few guests chuckled softly. Louis smiled on instinct, because smiling was something he'd learned to do whenever adults laughed. It usually smoothed things over. The pianist's gaze drifted past Louis and landed on the grand piano in the corner of the room. It was polished to perfection, placed more for decoration than sound. The lid was closed, the keys untouched. "Does he play?" the pianist asked casually, though the amusement in his voice gave him away. William answered before Louis could speak, keeping his tone light. "Not formally," he said, "since he's still quite young." The pianist nodded, then looked back at Louis with open amusement. "Such small hands," he said. "But I suppose every royal child thinks they can play before they understand what music actually demands." The adults laughed again, louder this time. Louis didn't laugh. He didn't fully grasp the words, but he understood the tone. Children feel pressure before it lands, the way they sense rain before it falls. Then the pianist pushed it further. Gesturing toward the piano, he said, "Well then, why don't we hear something? Go on, young prince. Show us what you've got." It sounded playful on the surface, light, almost generous, but the room locked up instantly. Every single eye turned toward Louis. His face grew hot, his ears burned, and his breath caught. He looked at his mother, then his father. No one stepped in fast enough. and no one realized that to him this didn't feel like a game at all. Louis shook his head slightly and said, "I don't," but the pianist cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Oh, it's just a few notes," he said. "It's only a piano, don't be shy." And there it was, the joke. Not cruel enough to protest, not obvious enough to stop, but sharp enough to corner a child and wait for him to stumble. Louis stood frozen, his fingers curled into his palms. He had never touched that piano before. Not this one, not in front of all these people. Silence pressed in from every direction, thick and heavy. Catherine finally spoke, gently telling Louis that he didn't have to play if he didn't want to. But the damage was already done. Louis felt it, the familiar ache of being too much and not enough at the same time. Too loud for quiet rooms, never good enough for serious ones. The pianist smiled again and shrugged. He added that he sometimes forgot himself, saying children were better suited to waving than playing. The laughter that followed was polite, controlled, and heavy. It landed squarely on Louis's small shoulders. Louis didn't cry. He didn't run. Royal children are taught to stand tall, even when the ground shifts. So he nodded, stepped back, and folded his hands exactly the way he had been taught. To everyone else, it was just another small, forgettable exchange in a long royal afternoon. But inside Louis, something shifted and stayed shifted. That night, long after the guests had gone and Windsor had settled into its quiet hush, Louis lay awake staring at the shadowed ceiling. He replayed the moment again and again, not fully understanding why it hurt so much. He wasn't angry, he was locked in, because what no one in that room knew, and what no one bothered to notice, was that Prince Louis already knew the piano. Not the polished showpiece downstairs, but a forgotten one hidden far from curious eyes. A piano that didn't laugh, didn't judge, but listened. From that night on, every soft note he played in secret carried the echo of that smile. What the pianist thought was harmless had planted a seed, and when it grew, it stunned everyone who laughed that day. The next morning, Windsor woke to its usual rhythm. Footsteps, laughter, quiet instructions echoing through stone halls. Sunlight spilled across the castle walls, promising a fresh start. But Louis barely noticed. His mind stayed trapped on the day before. The polite laughter, the subtle mockery, the moment he felt small. He slipped from his bed quietly and crossed the polished floor. Outside, gardeners trimmed hedges while birds hopped across the paths. His siblings were already deep into lessons, but Louis had somewhere else to be. He made his way toward a forgotten corner of the castle, far from the main rooms. Months earlier, he had discovered a hidden space in the north wing, one hardly anyone visited. It was his secret, his refuge. Inside sat an old, upright piano, worn and tired but real. The keys were chipped, the wood stained with old teacup rings from decades past. The pedals creaked when pressed, echoing through the rafters like whispers from another time. This piano wasn't perfect. Some keys stuck, others lagged behind. It demanded patience, and Louis loved it for that. He felt connected to it, both of them tucked away, underestimated, waiting quietly for someone to notice their worth. It was here that Prince Louis had been teaching himself to play, slowly, carefully, and far from the eyes of cameras and the expectations of royal life. Slowly and carefully, Louis lowered himself onto the piano bench and rested his hands above the keys, feeling their cool surface under his fingertips. The first notes came out cautious and light, but they were not random. He wasn't guessing anymore. He was following a path that had been laid out long before him. For months, he had practiced in silence, building muscle memory, one note at a time, teaching his fingers where to go even when his nerves tried to pull him back. Louis had spent countless afternoons tucked away inside the palace library, wandering through tall shelves filled with history and dust. That was where he found it. A leather-bound music collection, aged and worn, with pages softened by time. It had once belonged to his grandmother, Princess Diana. He knew the stories. He had heard how she stunned audiences in 1988 when she performed a difficult piano piece in Australia, playing from memory, calm and fearless. As Louis flipped through the pages, he noticed faint pencil marks in the margins, small notes written in her handwriting, Touching the same pages she once turned made him feel connected in a way words never could. He wasn't just a child pressing keys in a forgotten room. He was a grandson reclaiming something the world had quietly let fade, a family legacy that lived between notes and pauses. Days rolled into weeks after that afternoon at Windsor. Lewis's practice sessions grew longer, more focused, and more deliberate. To the public, he was still the playful prince, the energetic child who pulled faces on balconies and waved with too much enthusiasm. But beneath that familiar image, something steady was forming. He was learning patience. He was learning discipline. And slowly, he realized that music gave him a voice when words failed him completely. The pianist's dismissive words stayed lodged in his mind. "Children are better suited to waving than playing," the man had said. Those words followed Louis into every practice session. Instead of fading, they hardened into motivation. Whenever his fingers slipped or his wrists grew tired, he remembered how small he had felt standing in that room full of adults. He remembered the laughter that wasn't kind. And instead of stopping, he pushed through it. Louis spent even more time in the Palace Library, studying sheet music and teaching himself the basics of musical theory. He didn't just want to play notes, he wanted to understand them. His parents began to notice changes. One evening, William mentioned quietly, "He seems different lately." There was something calmer about him, something grounded, Catherine agreed, nodding slowly. They had no idea that their youngest son was slipping away for hours at a time, sitting at that old, upright piano, teaching himself with a seriousness that would have surprised anyone who only knew him from public appearances. One afternoon, during a steady rainstorm, Louis practiced longer than ever before. Rain tapped softly against the windows, blending with the notes echoing through the hidden room. For the first time, it didn't feel like practice, it felt like music. By the time he stopped, his fingers ached and his wrists were sore, but something else filled him too. A deep, quiet sense of accomplishment, the kind that comes from working hard at something that actually matters. Louis wasn't trying to hide his practice exactly, but he wasn't announcing it either. This was his space, his effort, his escape, a part of life where he didn't need to perform for cameras or meet expectations. He was just a boy learning to play because he wanted to. Then everything shifted. One evening, King Charles mentioned that the family had received an invitation to the International Harmony Gala, a prestigious classical music event attended by the most influential figures in the music world. Among the guest list was the same pianist who had dismissed Louis weeks earlier. When Louis heard the name, something stirred inside him. The gala was still weeks away, but he felt it immediately. This wasn't just another event. Catherine noticed the change in her son's expression. "It will be a long evening," she said gently, her tone formal, but caring. "Do you think you'll manage?" Louis nodded and said he would be fine, but inside his heart was racing. He wasn't planning to draw attention or cause trouble, but he knew something had changed since that afternoon at Windsor. Even at his age, he understood how humiliation worked in royal life. Once people decided who you were, it was hard to change their minds. Royal children were expected to be perfect, polite, capable, talented, and unshakable. When he hadn't defended himself that day, it felt like he had lost something important. Dignity mattered, even to a child. Now, the only way to get it back was to prove he was more than what they assumed. He needed to shape his image before the world did it for him. As the gala drew closer, Louis practiced with renewed focus. The skill he had been building in private was getting sharper, stronger, more confident. He didn't know exactly how it would be tested, but he knew it would be. And slowly, he realized that this wasn't just about the pianist anymore, it was about proving something to himself. Here's where things get interesting. The invitation wasn't for just any venue, it was for an evening at the Royal Albert Hall, the iconic red brick landmark with its massive glass dome rising over London like a crown. The family travelled from Windsor to the city as night settled in. Louis sat quietly in the car, watching the lights grow brighter through the window. This wasn't like the royal variety performances with loud music and colourful displays. This was serious. The International Harmony Gala was an event where every note mattered. Musicians performed not just to entertain, but to be remembered. The atmosphere felt heavy the moment they arrived. The Royal Albert Hall had hosted countless events, but this one carried a different weight. It was about tradition, excellence, and reputation. Those invited were people whose opinions shaped careers. Critics, patrons, composers, donors, and performers filled the space. Every movement felt measured, every interaction polished. Soft string music floated through the corridors as guests arrived in formal attire. Warm light reflected off polished floors. Everything was designed to feel controlled and precise. There was no room for surprises. At least that's what everyone believed. Prince Louis entered with his family, dressed neatly and standing tall. Walking through those massive doors meant stepping into a world where perfection was expected. He looked small among towering figures and dark suits, yet eyes still found him. He stayed close to Catherine. Her expression remained calm, but she watched him carefully. She remembered Windsor. She knew rooms like this could overwhelm him. And then there he was. The pianist. He stood near the centre of the room, surrounded by admirers and fellow musicians. His posture was confident, his voice steady as he spoke about music and performance. He was a symbol of mastery. His approval could open doors or quietly close them. He was scheduled to perform that night, and his presence alone raised expectations. When his eyes passed over Prince Louis, there was a pause, subtle, brief, but real. He remembered the boy. He remembered Windsor. He remembered the quiet embarrassment that followed his joke. To him, it had been insignificant, just a passing moment. Children forgot things quickly, or so he believed. He expected nothing from Louis now. If anything, he expected the same restless energy, the same discomfort. He did not expect confidence. He certainly did not expect talent. In his mind, that chapter was already closed. As guests were guided into the main hall, the mood shifted again. Rows of chairs faced the stage where a grand piano waited beneath soft lights. Programs were handed out. Conversations faded into silence. The gala was about to begin. Prince Louis sat between his parents, his feet just barely missing the floor. He swung them once, then stopped, remembering where he was. His hands rested neatly in his lap. His face stayed calm, but his chest felt tight. The room felt massive. The silence pressed in. Behind the scenes, the pianist prepared himself. Known for control, yet even he felt unsettled. Perhaps it was the scale of the room or the weight of expectations from those who shaped careers with a single review. He ran through the opening passages in his mind, already imagining the applause. He did not think about Prince Louis. To him, the boy was just a footnote in a long day. He wasn't angry. He simply didn't believe a child could understand the kind of pressure that was weighing on him now. Children were there to enjoy the atmosphere, the lights, the applause, and the idea of music, not the full emotional weight that professionals carried with every note. This gala had been designed with balance in mind. It was meant to feel elegant but accessible, formal but welcoming. The kind of evening where tradition and future promise sat side by side without clashing. The purpose was explained clearly at the start, with practiced calm and respectful pacing. The host spoke about classical music not as something frozen in the past, but as something alive, something meant to be passed down carefully from one generation to the next. This night existed to support education, preservation, and legacy. It honoured artists who had already proven themselves, while quietly encouraging those still learning to listen, observe, and dream. The audience responded with polite nods and soft applause, the kind that showed understanding rather than excitement. Everything felt controlled, almost too controlled. Then the pianist walked on stage. The applause that followed was respectful and measured, the sound of a crowd that already expected excellence before the first note was played. He acknowledged it with a brief nod, calm on the surface, disciplined in posture. He adjusted the bench, rolled his shoulders once, and placed his hands on the keys as the room fell into complete silence. This was his domain. Everyone in that room knew it, or at least they thought they did. At first, nothing seemed wrong. His fingers moved smoothly, the melody familiar and clean. But something subtle shifted beneath the surface. The confidence that usually arrived with the opening measures didn't fully land. A small error slipped in early, tiny, almost invisible to anyone untrained. But to him, and to the other musicians in the room, it landed loudly. His focus tightened instead of easing. Rather than letting the music carry him, he began to push against it, trying to regain control instead of trusting the flow. That tension didn't go unnoticed. Prince Louis listened from his seat, not analysing technique, not judging form, just feeling the sound as it filled the space. Louis didn't understand every rule of the piece, but he understood emotion. He noticed the hesitation in the pianist's expression, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way the music felt slightly held back. Without realizing it, Louis leaned forward, curious, engaged, absorbing every detail the way children naturally do when something captures them. The pianist continued, professional and composed, but the performance wasn't unfolding the way he had envisioned. It was still very good, better than most, but it wasn't extraordinary, and in that room, expectations were unforgiving. The audience sensed it too. No whispers, no glances, just a collective awareness settling in. The energy shifted quietly. This wasn't failure, but it wasn't magic either. When the final note faded, the applause returned, polite and supportive, but restrained in a way that spoke volumes. The pianist stood, acknowledged the crowd, and returned to his seat with his jaw tightening for just a fraction of a second. He felt it slipping. Control mattered to him. Authority mattered. And the evening wasn't finished yet. As the program continued, something shifted behind the scenes. A brief discussion, a subtle recalculation. The host returned to the stage, explaining there would be a short transition. That was when attention drifted, not toward the stage, but toward the audience. Prince Louis shifted slightly in his seat. He felt eyes on him, though he couldn't explain why. Someone near the aisle glanced his way, then another. A soft murmur rippled briefly through a section of the room before settling again. This wasn't planned. There was no announcement. It emerged from tension, from impulse, from a need to redirect the moment. When the pianist stood again, his tone was light, almost playful, masking the irritation beneath. He gestured toward the front row and spoke about inspiration, about the next generation. Half joking, he suggested that perhaps a young royal guest might enjoy seeing the piano up close. The room reacted instantly, before anyone fully processed what was happening. Catherine's hand tightened briefly around her son's. William leaned forward, uncertain, assessing the moment. There was no formal refusal, no clear acceptance, just motion, unfolding too quickly to stop. A staff member stepped forward gently and guided Louis toward the aisle. He stood, heart already racing, and began walking toward the stage. Each step felt longer than the last. The room watched him closely, not with warmth, but with curiosity. By the time he reached the edge of the stage, his heartbeat thundered in his ears. He stopped, unsure of what was expected. The pianist looked down at him, assessing the situation with calm certainty. The thought crossed his mind that this would pass easily. A child couldn't disrupt the evening. Whatever happened next, he assumed, would reinforce the difference between discipline and play. Louis stood with his hands at his sides. His fingers tingled. The piano sat only a few steps away, massive and gleaming under the lights. The room waited. Suspended in a moment, no one had rehearsed. Before anyone could intervene, before protocol could catch up with reality, Louis took a small step forward. He moved carefully, the same way he did when entering unfamiliar rooms, testing the ground, trusting instinct over fear. A member of staff hesitated near the edge of the stage, then stopped. No instruction came, no rule applied cleanly. Catherine shifted in her seat but didn't rise. William leaned forward, eyes fixed on his son. The silence wasn't demanded. It happened naturally. No one wanted to interrupt whatever was unfolding. Louis reached the bench and paused. Up close, the piano looked enormous. The polished surface reflected the lights, the keys stretching farther than he was used to. He adjusted the bench with both hands, the soft scrape echoing through the hall, then climbed up, his feet dangling just above the floor. The pianist watched closely. He expected nerves, hesitation, uncertainty. Instead, he saw something that made him straighten in his seat. Louis didn't rush. He didn't touch the keys immediately. He placed his hands above them and waited, listening, as if tuning himself to something only he could hear. Then he played. The first note was soft, but it carried weight, clean, steady. A second followed, Then a third, not random, not careless, measured, intentional, programs lowered, heads tilted forward. This wasn't noise. This wasn't a joke. It was a child placing notes with purpose in a room full of people trained to recognize purpose when they heard it. Louis continued, the melody simple but controlled. He didn't rush. He didn't force volume. When a note lingered, he let it breathe. When the sound faded, he adjusted naturally. He wasn't commanding the piano, he was listening to it. The pianist felt something slip. Confidence, assumption, certainty. This wasn't guessing. This was familiarity. The boy knew how to sit, how to breathe, how to let silence speak. These were things that couldn't be picked up casually. They weren't tricks. They were instincts. Catherine felt tears rise before she understood why. She recognized that stillness, that focused calm. William watched in quiet disbelief, realizing how much of this had unfolded beyond their sight. The room held its breath. As the final notes faded, Louis left his hands on the keys for a moment, then lowered them into his lap. He slid off the bench carefully and stood, suddenly aware of the silence pressing in around him. No one clapped immediately. His heart hammered. In that heavy quiet, one thought surfaced clearly, something drilled into him gently but firmly over time. You must bow. It was what a musician did. It was what a prince did. He bowed slowly, deeply, head lowered with careful respect. The silence shifted, no longer heavy, but thoughtful. Then applause began, slow at first, spreading through the hall. Not loud, not wild, but full of respect. The pianist spoke softly, his voice steady and sincere. I was wrong, he said. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't for attention. It was recognition. Louis stood still, hands at his sides, unsure what came next. Catherine reached him first, kneeling to pull him gently into an embrace. William placed a steady hand on his shoulder. The gala continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Conversations afterwards sounded different. Less about perfection, more about humility, less about reputation, more about listening. For those who were there, the moment lasted not because a child played the piano, but because a room full of experts learned something unexpected. They had underestimated the quietest person in it. And that lesson stayed. So now we want to hear from you. What did this moment mean to you? Do you think Louis inherited this sensitivity and musical instinct from Princess Diana? Or was this simply a reminder that talent sometimes shows up quietly before anyone thinks to look? If you've ever surprised someone who underestimated you, share your story below. We read the comments, and your thoughts matter more than you think. And if moments like this are the reason you watch, take a second to support the channel. Tap like, drop a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There's another story waiting on your screen right now, and trust us, you'll want to see it.